Okay, good morning. Again, welcome to folks. I'm so delighted to welcome this morning one of our keynote speakers, Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker. She is a theologian, educator, social activist, minister, and musician. She is an ordained United Methodist minister who holds dual ministerial fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association. And she served as president of Star King School for the Ministry for 25 years. Now she is professor of theology emerita and president emerita there. And she's the theologian and author and co-author of multiple books, including co-authored with Rita Nakashima Brock, her book, Proverbs of Ashes, Redemptive Violence and the Search for What Saves Us. And it's her work there that particularly excited us to invite her to speak for us today. So I invite you to join me in welcoming her. And I'll also say for her, I know she's experiencing some noise where she is that we may hear during her talk. And so I invite us all to try and draw on our patience and to be able to hear, take it as a spiritual lesson to hear what is meaningful for us and to let go of the part that is not so meaningful for us. So welcome, Dr. Parker. You can give me a moment. Go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon, for that welcome. And it's great to be with all of you today. I'm honored to make a contribution to the wonderful work that the San Diego Regional Interfaith Collaborative is doing. We're living in a time where multi-religious cooperation and collaboration is an important sign of the possibilities of strengthening our communities in the midst of all of our differences and working together for the common good. So thank you for the wonderful work you are doing and for including me today. Our topic, family violence, a pandemic within a pandemic, as Daniel said in his introduction, is a critical one right now. We know that during COVID-19, the incidence of calls for help for domestic violence have gone up. One report says that though 9/11 calls have been down in general, domestic violence calls have been up 20, 25%. Some people say 50% up. One hospital in Massachusetts reported that since the start of the pandemic, nearly all of their emergency room visits from women, except those related to COVID, were due to domestic violence incidents. So just a few more examples of how much it matters that we address this topic. And we also know not only are incidents of domestic violence perhaps on the increase right now, that it is also more difficult for people to seek help. The pandemic complexifies the help when shelters and hospitals or churches may expose one to COVID. It may be harder to choose to leave a violent situation to go to a place of safety. We know that children who are isolated at home and not in school or other activities are out of the eyesight of those helpers and healers, teachers, counselors, and others who otherwise might be observing the signs of physical or emotional abuse. So that increases their risk. We know that abusers abuse to assert power and control, and that all of us are feeling less in control with the uncertainties of COVID, with unemployment or job loss. So this loss of control may be an escalating factor for some abusers. And we also know that racism and discrimination against LGBTQ people and immigrants make these communities and populations even more at risk. So they experience a pandemic within a pandemic within a pandemic. So for all these reasons, as people of faith, our hearts are moved, our minds and our hands are things we want to put to use in helping and doing what we can. Religion can be a pathway for healing and help for those experiencing domestic violence. It also, unfortunately, can be a roadblock to healing and help. And as faith leaders, we need to pay attention to how religion functions as a roadblock that can make abuse worse, can trap people in abusive situations, and those things that allow religion to be a true wellspring of healing, help, and support. So for my part today, I want to ask us to pay attention, to delve into and reflect on how religion can be a roadblock and how it can be a pathway. And in our diverse religious traditions, whether we're Buddhists or Christians or Muslims or Jews or Indigenous or pagan or Unitarian Universalist, the specific application of what I have to say is something you yourself may need to work on. I am most familiar as a Christian theologian, and so I come from that perspective, but my own multi-religious work has taught me that in all of our traditions and communities, religion can be a roadblock or a pathway. And I invite us all to think about that. So I'd like to tell a story from early in my experience as a young minister that has shaped my whole understanding over many years about domestic violence. One afternoon, I was in my study, and a knock came on the study door. When I opened the door, a woman who wasn't from our congregation was there. She had sad brown eyes and looked weary, and she introduced herself. I'm Lucia, she said. I live in the neighborhood, and I walk by your church, and I see on the church sign that you are a woman priest. That's what she called me. And maybe because you are a woman, you will understand my problem and can help me. So I invited her in, hoping I could be of some help. She said, my problem is my husband. Mostly he's a good man, but sometimes he hits me. One time he broke my arm, but at the hospital, I was too ashamed to tell them how my arm had gotten broken. I went to my priest 20 years ago at Sacred Heart and asked him what I should do. And he told me that I should rejoice in my sufferings, that they brought me closer to Jesus, and that if I loved my husband, I would bear these, his hitting me, I would bear it, this abuse, the way Jesus bore the cross out of love for us. And that in this way, I would grow closer to God. Then she looked me right in the eye and she said, I've been following my priest's advice for all these years, but now he's going after the children. And what I want to know is what the priest told me true? So in that moment, for a moment, I could not speak. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. I knew how I should answer Lucia's question, but I was aware that just that past Sunday, though I was a liberal Christian and wouldn't have preached that Jesus' suffering and torture on the cross was a sign of love, I had just preached that last sermon, that last Sunday, a sermon about love. And I said, love endures all things, bears all things. Love thinks only for the well-being of the other and gives no thought to the self. Love keeps relationships and holds and never breaks relationships, no matter what it costs. And I realized that if I was going to answer Lucia's question the way I knew I needed to, I was going to have to rethink my theology, what I was preaching. And not only that, but choices I was making in my own life based on what I thought a faithful, loving Christian would do. So all that went through my head. And then finally, I found my voice and I said to Lucia, What the priest told you is not true. God does not want you to suffer and to be hurt in your home. God does not want your children to be beaten and injured by their father. God wants you to have abundant life and be free from violence, and your children as well. When she heard this, Lucia's sad face broke into a big, sunny smile. And she said, I knew I was right, but it helps to hear you say so. Now, I'll tell you some more about Lucia's story before I finish my talk this morning. But I want to pause here and notice how many lessons can be drawn from this, this experience, this story. First one is, for those of us who are religious leaders, and let me just make sure I'm following my notes here. The words we say, the teachings we offer matter. What we say in our sermons, what we sing in our songs, offer in our prayers, enact in our rituals, teach in our pastoral counseling, in all those settings, the way we represent our faith tradition is used by people who are experiencing violation, humiliation, and abuse and oppression to interpret their experience and find a way to respond or make choices. If our religious teachings tell people, give people the sense that, or even directly tell them, as Lucia was told, that we should bear abuse, that love is willing to suffer anything without breaking relationships. If our teachings are doing this, then we are, through our religion and our leadership, presenting roadblocks to people who are being violated in their home, women and children, and also men are sometimes the victims of violence. Same-sex couples can be places of intimate violence. So we are placing roadblocks for people. I've told this story about Lucia many times, and whenever there's an audience in which there are people who have worked in domestic violence shelters or as social workers with women, I hear again how often it is devout women who have the hardest time seeking help and who have to grapple with their religious ideas in order to make choices to do what they can for themselves and their children, to move out of violent situations and protect their lives. And I learned this even more painfully with another experience I had early in my ministry as a young woman serving a congregation in the Northwest. One of my clergy sisters, Pat, was serving a very small church in a town in a rural area, in a very small town. There were no social services for women or for domestic violence within about 50 miles. So she made the parsonage a shelter for abused women and let it be known in the community. And women who needed a place to go to get away from being injured would come and stay at the parsonage for a time. And she'd support them and work with them and encourage them. One of the women who came to her for shelter was named Enola Reed. And eventually Enola felt that it was her Christian duty to go back home. She was a very committed Lutheran, and she believed strongly that her role as a woman was to keep the family together. And so she went back to her abusive husband. And in front of their 3 children, he stabbed her to death one night. So women sometimes, in an effort to be faithful to their religious views, expose themselves to risking their very lives. And as religious leaders, we need to know how much our teachings matter and what kind of impact they can have. Second lesson then that draws from this one, as faith leaders, we have to be willing to critically examine our own tradition and our own teachings. And I think we need to use the interpretive questioning principle of asking or anything we preach or teach or pray or sing, what message will this send to a person who is experiencing domestic violence, being battered or incested, or in some way in their home, suffering? What will the message be? And what will it be for those who are abusing? Will it tell those who are abusing that what they're doing is okay, it's like what God does? Or will it tell abusers that there's help for them, but they have to change their ways? So we should ask that we should ask that of all that we teach, of our whole faith tradition. The third lesson I would take from this is that if we critically examine whether what our tradition is teaching is a roadblock or a pathway for healing, we ourselves may have to change. I had to change choices I was making, ways I was understanding my Christian faith and life because of my work with domestic violence victims and survivors. So be open to being changed by your pastoral commitment to those who are suffering violation. So let me take some moments and just name some of the religious teachings that I have learned we need to examine. And I'll name them and they'll be familiar to you, and we don't have time to unpack all of them in detail, but I hope this will spark your thinking. One of the most obvious ones is the teaching that men are ordained by God to rule over women, and that God has ordained women's role to be obedient and submissive and to be silent. Abusers use this theology to justify exerting power and control over women and children. And victims of abuse can blame themselves for being battered as having failed to be obedient, as having been too willful or said too much, not been silent enough, submissive enough. So the cycle of abuse continues. All the world's major religions have this patriarchal bias, and which we have learned to say is cultural and social more than religious. And we need to separate our faith from it. For Christians and Jews, one of the tools we have is to look carefully at the Genesis story. That when God proclaims that men are to rule over women, it is a sign of life outside of the garden, life alienated or separated from God. In the paradise garden, in life as God has intended it to be, women and men are not in a dominant and submissive relationship, but are in a relationship of equality. So God's purpose is equality, mutual help, respect, support, not dominance and submission. That's the state of sin. Another teaching of many of our faith traditions is that woman's role is to maintain peace in the home, to be the angel of the house who keeps everyone together and keeps things peaceful and happy. This is what Enola Reed believed. It's a strong teaching in Orthodox Judaism about women's roles. And while there's much that's beautiful about this, it can lead peace in the home to be a one-sided responsibility, the responsibility of the woman in the home. And that if there is not peace, even if it is the husband who's disturbing the peace, it is the woman's responsibility. So she may feel blamed and shamed, and abusers again can use this. It's your role to keep peace in the home, to exercise power and control over even the tiniest things, like whether the meat is cooked right at dinner time. So this control can become extremely oppressive when women are held responsible for all the peace in the home. Another thing that's very prevalent in our theistic traditions is the imagining of God as male. As Mary Daly said, an early feminist philosopher, over 50 years ago, if God is male, males are God, and so that men can associate themselves with the divine. And the corollary teaching often is that women are imperfect men, are less than fully human, and are have to be controlled and managed by men. So some of you know the wonderful book, The Color Purple by Alice Walker. In it, the character Shug is trying to tell Celie, who is a survivor of abuse, to be open to the possibility of seeing God and finding God, because Celie has given up on God. She's been so hurt. And Shug says, when I learned that God was white and a male, I lost interest. All the men's I know are low down and mean. I had to get men off my eyeball before I could see God. That's a paraphrase. So another teaching related to this about gender is that God has created human beings, male and female, and ordained heterosexual marriage as a sign of God's love. This teaching, again, has much that's beautiful about it, but it isolates those who do not conform to gender norms. So same-sex couples, transgender people, or even elders who have been widowed and no longer and are alone, or are dependent on living with a family, but are no longer in a marriage. All these folks and these identities can be viewed as outside of God's plan or God's will or God's purpose for our lives. So that makes them more vulnerable to as targets of abuse and control. Then there's the teaching that children are born sinful with original sin. I'm aware of religious education materials for young children where teachers are told to view, this is in some Christian evangelical materials, teachers are to view children as who are willful or disobedient, or don't behave with a lot of self-control, that these characteristics are signs of the sinfulness of the child, that the devil is in them. And the purpose of religious education is to get the devil out of the child, so that beating children is seen as a way to redeem them from their sin or controlling them. So spare the rod, spoil the child. And many abusers see themselves as carrying out a divine imperative to save their children from their sin. That's a heartbreaking implication of that teaching. Then there's another corollary to that then, and that is the idea that God uses violence to punish evildoers or sinners, and also uses violence to redeem or save sinners. This is, in this theological framework, God threatens hell and offers the reward of heaven. And the threat of hell in some theological frameworks is released from, lifted from human beings because of Jesus' atoning death on the cross. And God the Father, in this narrative theology, sent Jesus to the world to fulfill his Father's will, that he suffer and die on the cross. And in this way, bear the punishment that all humanity deserves for its sin. And those who believe in him and receive his grace are freed from the threat of violence, of eternal damnation, are saved. Some of the women theologians I've worked with and womanist theologians, as we have grappled with how our Christian and Jewish traditions, this one is a Christian idea, have impacted domestic abuse victims. We have called this theological framework divine child abuse, because the virtue of Jesus in this narrative is that he submitted to his Father's will that he be humiliated, tortured, and killed. Now, this is then taught as a sign of God's love and of Jesus' love. This is the theology behind what kept Lucia for 20 years in an abusive situation, because her priest told her she should be like Jesus. She should accept abuse, that it was redemptive, that it was loving. I learned some more from another story, a dear friend of mine who I'll call Elizabeth, about how this teaching can impact children. Elizabeth was a seminary classmate of mine. She became a wonderful Methodist minister, a loving, serving person. But she came through a harrowing childhood. Beginning when she was about 6, her father sexually abused her, and until she left home. Her father was a leader in the community, a member of the state legislature, the high school guidance counselor, and a leader in their church. And when he was raping his own child, he would tell her that God approved of what he was doing, that he and God were like this, but that if she told his secret to anyone, he would kill himself. So Elizabeth said, I live to go to church on Sunday because at church, I heard about the sufferings of Jesus, about how his Father asked him to drink the cup of suffering and how he died on the cross, and everyone sang his praises and adored Jesus, and Jesus' suffering gave people life. So I believed that my pain and violation was keeping my Father alive and was praiseworthy. And that's how I endured. So what I see in this and know from this is that her Christian community gave Elizabeth some comfort, some way to endure, but it did not give her any resources for affirming her sacred worth and dignity, her right to be free from such abuse. And it didn't give any indication that what her father was doing was wrong. It was like what God does. So this can be a very disturbing thing to have to reflect on for those who believe this theological framework, but it's an important one to grapple with. And the final one I'll mention is the idea that abused persons should forgive their abusers. And this one is an okay message, but not without the message that forgiveness is only appropriate when there has been repentance and repair. So just to tell people, forgive the abuser, he doesn't know what he's doing, have compassion on him, have mercy on him, will not serve to transform the situation and bring about something better for the abuser and something better for the victim. So just quickly, there are many positive alternatives to these teachings that we can lift up. Proclaim that all people are of sacred worth, of inherent value, that all are created in the image of God. Proclaim equality before God, and that freedom and equality are God's desire for us. Teach that God is larger than any of our human categories, and use a whole array of metaphors, not just that God is like a man or God is like a warrior, like a king, but God is like a loving mother, like a sheltering tree, like a rock, like a wind. And remember the wisdom of the Jewish tradition that God's name ultimately cannot be spoken, that our ways of imagining God can too easily become idolatrous and can cause harm. So keep our notions of the divine fluid, open, diverse, and affirmative of many expressions of human life. proclaim God's promise of abundant life for all of us. The prophetic Jewish teachings and the Islamic teachings of, and the Christian teachings of abundant life, just life, sustainable life, ethical life, and the promises of protection from harm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. All of the things that promise to the oppressed that their burdens will be lifted, and that the religious community is there to assure the wholeness and freedom of all our lives. So here's the end of Lucia's story and the end of my talk. After Lucia smiled that big smile, she started working on a plan for how she could change her situation. She went back to school and got a skill that would allow her to get a job so that she could support herself and her children. And when she was ready, and with the support from me and others, she took the step of separating from her husband, going to work, taking care of her children, getting free from the oppressive situation, the violence. And then her husband went back to the priest and asked for help, and the priest understood that he had not given the right counsel, and began to work with her husband to face what he was doing and to get help for his controlling and angry ways of being. So in the end, Lucia said, my children got their father back and I got my life back. So it is possible for situations of domestic violence to be transformed, for people to get help. It can be a long process. It takes accompaniment, it takes care. And for those of us who are faith leaders, let us take our role seriously to teach and preach and give examples in our own lives of the liberating and healing power of God, and let go of those things that create roadblocks and burdens for those who are oppressed. Let us be joy bringers, not bringers of tears. Thank you.